All right, so let's talk about handbooks and manuals. This will be, again, an overview of areas that you need to consider, and I'll provide some fill-in as to what needs to be in there. But a lot of it's going to require you to research through elements for us. And thinking in terms of your project, my recommendation is that you contact 2 or 3 or 4 different churches and ask to see their policy manuals, their departmental manuals, those kind of things, to help create a basis for this. I want to ask you to be on the honor system and not to contact previous students to see what they did. Just because I want you to be able to do the effort and put in the work on the research process to actually do the learning. Otherwise, I think you're coming close to plagiarism, so let's not do that. All right, handbooks and manuals. We talked about this in reference to employees and benefits and such, but let's understand here, there's a difference between a handbook and a manual. Policy manuals are a complete reference and they're more for supervisors, whereas an employee handbook is a compilation of parts of the policy manual specifically for an employee. So, give you an example, Bethel has, we have an employment policy manual which covers the majority of the information that employees need to know. Then there is an executive leadership team policy manual, which is not shared outside of the executive leadership team. And then there is a board policy manual that is not shared outside of the board, but they all pertain to employment, and they cover procedural stuff, they cover systems, they cover consistent things. Essentially, one of the things that manuals provide for us is a continuation of information and knowledge. So the board policy manual covers things like employee bonuses, employee benefits, the salary structure. Even as part of the executive team, I know that ranges exist for salary. I don't actually know what the ranges are. That's the purview of the board. So with that, that would exist in their policy manual. Additionally, in the board policy manual, they would have procedural stuff for like hiring a new lead pastor in the eventuality that would ever happen. That doesn't need to be in an employee handbook or an employee manual because your employees aren't going to be responsible. But like in reference to hiring a new pastor, one of the things that is stipulated in the employee handbook is that upon the resignation of the lead pastor, the entire staff will resign also. And they will keep their jobs, but they will resign until the new lead pastor determines whether he wants to retain them or not. And that's actually pretty standard practices in a lot of churches. They didn't actually do that when Pastor Glenn came in, but it is one of those things that we have instituted as a policy because it helps with not making the lead pastor, the new lead pastor, be responsible for firing old people. But that would be an example of something that's stipulated in an employee handbook that pertains to something that's really in the board manual. So understanding that policy manuals and handbook have some differences, but realistically many churches choose to combine manuals. And a lot of times they have policies and procedures that aren't necessarily written, but they are stated. And there's a challenge that's presented when you have a policy that is unwritten. One of the biggest challenges is that it becomes difficult to enforce or to demonstrate consistency in the eventuality that an employee accuses you of improper behavior. So let's say, going back to our salary example that I had before, there was no policy or procedure for determining salary. And the reason that the church had lost the lawsuit on the pay structure because there was no policy established and they couldn't demonstrate a consistent behavior for that. So that's the advantage of that. Many churches choose to combine manuals. I'm not really sure how I feel on that, honestly. I think there needs to be some level of, and it's going to be dependent upon the size of the church. In a smaller church, there's going to be much more overlap because you won't have. In a church of 300, you're going to have a lead pastor and staff. You're not going to have necessarily the executive structure that we have at a church of the size of Bethel. Or, we were talking about this the other day at lunch or at dinner. Think about Joel Osteen's church. There are 42,000 people. 42,000 people is the size of their church. Pastoral staff-wise, they probably have 40 or 50 pastors on staff that handle pastoral roles. Joel Osteen probably meets with 7 or 8 executive pastors that handle the elements of the church and a creative team. So a lot of the execution and completion of stuff gets pushed down. So really from the procedural and policy stuff, I would be willing to bet that Joel Osteen, as the lead pastor of that church, does not do much day-to-day with the actual direct employees or constituents, for that matter. He's got teams of people handle that. So the structure at a church of 42,000 is significantly different than a church of 300. So, yeah, I mean, at 42,000, I'm sure they've got over 300 employees. So, yeah, it's crazy when you start thinking that size. So, also, let's just understand what a policy manual, employee relations direct to supervision. I don't know what I have written there. Oh, this is what's covered in a policy manual. This covers your structure, who is the supervisor for whom, what procedural elements do we need to know, how does something done. You know, a procedure is how something is done. A policy will dictate for you what is done. Rules, expectations, those kind of things. What time does work start? Policies will go along very along with rules. Policy manuals cover a broad range of topics, and they're important to understand because what they do, I think I've already talked to this, they provide clarity and understanding for employees. No one likes to work in an environment where they don't know what the expectation is. It makes it very difficult. I can honestly say Bethel is the first church I've worked at that's had a clearly defined policy manual. Most of the items at previous churches have been handled by what the senior pastor felt like doing at that point in time. So even the church I referred to earlier that had like the 180-page policy manual, they still had a policy within the policy manual that said the lead pastor may amend the policy manual as he sees fit. So they actually had a policy that said the lead pastor didn't have to adhere to the policy manual, which that makes it hard to have consistent policies because they're going to like some people more than others. And one of the reasons that you have a policy manual is to help provide protection for the church and the employee. So who's the policy manual meant for? They're meant for supervisors so they understand their role, and is meant for, is it going to be for some employees? Is it going to be all employees? Policy manuals typically is mostly for supervisors, whereas a handbook is for employees. Here at Bethel, like I said, we have those 3 separate policy manuals, and there's a fair amount of overlap. But it's understanding how those function. And I think more and more churches are going to a streamlined process where there's overlap. There's certain segments. Like the general staff, they don't need to know the disciplinary process as far as criteria that the ELT uses for determining when discipline is appropriate. We do understand in the employee handbook policy manual what are disciplinable offenses for which they can be, whether it's terminated, suspended, write-up, where they understand the ramifications for these things. They don't necessarily always, they don't have the process that the ELT will go through in their discussion. So, which is appropriate. So things to understand is the policy manual contract. Policy manuals must exist within the framework of the various federal and state laws governing employment. So it is a contractual obligation in the sense of this is in the event that a lawsuit were to come up, these would be the standards by which the organization and the employer relationship would be judged. Realistically, this is why you want to make sure that your policy manual is reviewed by a third party or lawyer, because when a policy manual is written, if there's something that is unclear, ambiguity in a document favors the person that did not write it. So if an employee says you didn't do what the policy manual says, and they review it and say, well, it doesn't really say what should happen, the employee might be right. So you need to understand that. Understand that an employee manual can be a two-edged sword. It can be used in court against employers if you are inconsistent with the application of policies. It can be a warm, cuddly blanket for employers if you use it correctly. It can be a two-edged sword. It can be used against you if you don't use it correctly. Some policies can be targeted as being sexist, racist, or discriminatory. There are some elements that the church thinks that they are exempt from following. The ADA, like the American Disability Act, churches still have to be compliant on that. We still cannot discriminate. You can't discriminate as a church for race or gender. And for certain roles, this is what's being challenged. It's in some kind of flux, so don't quote me on this too much. Even religion is being challenged, where you don't necessarily have to hire somebody to provide a pastoral role that is of a different religious background, but if an administrative role, you may have to. And that's currently being challenged a little bit. So is the policy manual contract. Employers might find that they have a contract without intending one, and it usually is the result of poor interpretation of statements in the manual as promises. So employee policy manuals, if you say we're going to do this, if you do this, you could be creating a contractual obligation that you're not recognized or didn't realize you were doing. That's why careful wording is important. Now, for your policy manuals that you're going to turn into me, I don't expect you to run them by a lawyer, because lawyers are expensive, and the $100 an hour or whatever they charge.
You appreciate that.
Yeah, I figured that was probably maybe too much of an expectation to have you guys run things by a lawyer. It would seem cruel. So careful wording is important, though. Don't make commitments you don't want. So flexibility. Legal review is essential. Legal review is essential when establishing an actual policy manual, not necessarily for this assignment. But understand that you want to always reserve the right to make changes at any time and interpret and administer the policy manual in light of changing circumstances and events. So when you are establishing a policy manual for your church, you can't just set it and forget it. You should review it annually to make sure that the policies and procedures are still consistent with how you want things done and what is done or what isn't done. There's certain things like in Bethel's existing policy manual that we've made adjustments to, which no one complains about, but like in our policy manual, we stipulate what time work hours are. And in the summer, we break from that. It says the summer, the work hours are 8 to 4, but the policy manual says that work is 8:30 to 5. So employees don't complain because it's in their favor. But if you deviate from employment policies when it doesn't go in their favor, you're going to have problems. So make sure that you're evaluating and that you reserve the right to make changes. And when you make a change to a policy manual, you should adhere to the practice of having employees sign off that they have read and understand the change. That way, you're not making changes and people go, I didn't realize that that was different. It is, again, the culture and environment that we live in. It just helps you to cover all of your bases and make sure that you cannot be accused of doing something improperly or behind people's back or being sneaky. Don't be sneaky. Should policies be written? Not always, but usually. Again, remember, it's a two-edged sword. Don't ask me for an example because I'm not going to give you. But why should it be written? Unwritten policies tend to lead to misunderstanding, poor morale, and internal conflict. As much as you can clarify directly, the more clarity you have with everyone. And this is let's use office hours as an example. Does it need to be stipulated in a policy manual that work is 8:30 to 5? Not necessarily. Maybe it might be better to say work is, the work schedule is determined by the executive leadership team with an expected number of hours served in a day. That would be more flexible, but still have clarity in that. Because actually we're getting ready to discuss some potential changes to the work schedule, which I think will be favorable. But again, it'll have to be a change to our policy manual if we do that. So that's one of those areas where you can oftentimes find some good flexibility if you learn how to word things so that it gives you the greatest amount of freedom, but still provides clarity. So Written policies cut down on the number of redundant questions, which is good. This is the great thing as supervisors. When somebody asks, "Can I do this?" Oftentimes I can respond, "What does the policy manual say?" And if the response is, "I don't know," then I tell them to go look. And if the policy manual doesn't say, then we have to check with the executive leadership team. So, helpful in legal proceedings as long as it is followed. I think we talked about that sufficiently. But policy manuals, handbooks, procedural stuff. It's unfortunate that churches do find themselves being sued, but it does happen. People threaten litigation, and as the example I shared earlier, sometimes it's justified, sometimes it's not. So in writing a policy manual, here's some of the things that you need to go through in steps. You need to research, and you need to research and compile or create a compilation. You need to see what other churches are doing. And here's the important thing. You need to research churches of your size, churches larger than you, and churches in your area. So there are policies that are required by the state of California that might not have any application in the state of Virginia. Just a good example, California is not a right-to-work state. You know, it's not it's not an employment at will state, which is, Virginia is. Virginia is an at-will employment state. So that means, Virginia, we don't have to have a reason to fire you. We just let you go because we didn't like the pants you wore that day or something. We don't do that here at Bethel. We actually have a better reason if we let you go. But you have to understand how rules within your state apply to your employment situation. So you should research, you should look into costs, not just for writing manuals, but for the review. You need to give that consideration. If you're going to write a policy manual, which I obviously encourage, but you should have it reviewed by a lawyer. Our lawyer is, I said $100 an hour. Actually, our lawyer is $250 an hour. Yeah, it's not a bad gig if you can get it. But to review our policy manual, that's probably at least a 4 to 5 hour job. So we're going to pay him at least to review that.
Change your career paths.
Well, also change your educational costs. So, because law school follows your undergrad, so yeah, they're expensive. It's expensive. I have no desire to be a lawyer. So, think through your organization. How is the organization structured? And provide clarification. What areas of ambiguity, what areas of specificity do you need in your manual? Create a rough draft, numbering sections, how you're going to lay it out. This will be things you actually go through in your process too. Who needs to approve it? Who needs to approve it? For Bethel, our requirement is that it has to be approved by our church board. That is a requirement. So our policy manual. So if we determine to make a change that does require a change in the policy manual, it has to be approved by the board. Yeah. Well, typically that's not really much of an issue. If they have a point of clarity, it's typically a legal question more so than a procedural question. And since their primary area of responsibility is financial oversight, they are typically in office procedural stuff. They're pretty flexible on it. Our current board is different than our previous board. Our previous board wanted to run everything as if everyone here worked at the shipyard, because the majority of them worked at the shipyard. So it was very restrictive in its policy. But Pastor Glenn's perspective, which I agree with greatly, is that at church, in a church context, the only appreciable asset that you have are your people. So we can never pay people what they're worth. We can never give them the sufficient benefits for the amount of work they do, because obviously people don't go into ministry for the money. If they do, they need to find another job. But we can do everything we can to be pro-employee. So we're pro-employee in our policy manuals. We're very generous with our vacation. We're generous with our flexibility of hours. We're a generous organization. So that's really been the only kind of conflicts that we've had. And if they disagree with something, you know, we want to have a cooperative attitude and cooperative spirit. Typically, there's a conversation to work through and have a mutual understanding as to why this is felt to be important, and then come back through that. So it's just it's how you resolve any conflict, really. So, writing tips should be easily readable and organized. Don't write it all in a bunch of legal jargon. Avoid legalese and technical jargon. Use simple, short sentences. But again, use that word there, sentences. Okay, if you're going to do bullet points, that's fine. Just make sure that it's readable bullet points, and make sure that it is sentences. Be clear, not fuzzy. You want to create clarity. Understand the role of the policy manual is to create clarity, not confusion. Okay? If you create confusion and you find yourself in some form of litigation, the confusion does not go to your favor. The confusion works against you. Say what you mean. Don't insinuate promotions when there is no structure. Don't imply something can happen when it might not actually be the way the policy is structured. So again, that's just being clear. Be consistent throughout. That's just having somebody make sure that it's proofed well, grammatically it's consistent. Get third-party review. Get legal review. I think we've already said all that. So generally, what should be in the manual? There's a lot here of what should be in the manual. And for your assignment, we have broken them out for employee manuals versus office manuals, those kind of things. So generally, what should be in the manual? These are the kind of things that should be in an employee job description / benefits manual. Payroll and benefits, leave policy, what's the vacation, sick, conference, mission trips, holidays, kind of stuff. What's covered in there? You'd find these things in your job descriptions and employee manuals, or benefit manuals. Perks, tuition reimbursements, those kind of things. How do you guys handle education? Do you handle education? A lot of churches do, a lot of churches don't. Principles of work, what's the work expectation? How do you handle harassment? What's the supervision structure? Payroll, where is it at? What's the schedule for work? Inclement weather and civil emergency. How do you handle it if there's a snow day? Which, here's the ironic thing. In Virginia, if there is a dusting, they want to know if we're closing the office, and the answer is no. We closed the office a lot this year, and that's just amazing to me. Retirement age. Those are, again, termination, how's that handled? Organizational chart / level of staff, that's again, benefits, we already covered that. These are things that should be in a employee benefits manual. Manual should follow the American Disability Act, Age Discrimination and Employment Act. The church cannot discriminate based upon age. So if you advertise that you are hiring a youth pastor, and somebody that is 75 years old comes and applies, you better have a reason other than you're old for not hiring them.
Would the fact that you don't believe that they can relate to the youth be a good reason? Or would that kind of fall under the same?
Well, it depends upon how you're making that evaluation. If you're making that evaluation based upon conversations and personality and all that thing, that's one thing. If you're making that evaluation based solely on their age, see, in an employee interview, you're not allowed to ask them how old they are. I cannot ask you how old you are. You
ask them, like, what's the earliest presidential election they remember?
Well, I mean, typically they'll turn in, years they graduated high school, these kind of things. But you can extrapolate some guesses for age, but you can't ask age, because then you get discrimination opportunities. Just like you can't ask a female employee as you're hiring, when do you plan on getting pregnant? You can't do that. Get yourself fired on that one. Yeah?
Somebody just got fired because they were pregnant. Not like,
They got fired because they were pregnant?
yeah, but they didn't tell their employees that they were pregnant during the time they got hired.
They don't have to, right?
Yeah, they don't have to disclose that.
Yeah. So then they fired her because she lied that she was pregnant and that could be discrimination.
I would think so, yeah. Wow.
Very lot of free stuff.
Telling you.
Yeah. Churches still have to follow the Family Medical Leave Act. Now, this actually only applies to employers of 50 or more for full-time employees. So most churches are exempt from this, but Bethel gets close. I actually probably need to include in here like the Affordable Health Care Act. Eventually that's going to kick in for small churches too. We avoid, Bethel, when they do a full-time employees, they're not necessarily talking about people. They also have a thing called a full-time equivalency. So in the American Disabilities, not American Disabilities, the Affordable Health Care Act, they will take how many hours you have people working and add it up. So 30 hours is considered full-time in the Affordable Health Care Act. So if you have two 15-hour employees, they count as one full-time employee. So let's say you've got, and there's an example that was addressing this last year with a caterer that had like 60 contract employees. But between all of their hours, they added up to over 50 full-time employees. There's some ridiculous thing that they had going on. And so between that, they were going to be required to pay health insurance for all of these employees. They put them out of business. If we had to provide health care for all of our employees here at Bethel, because we've got, I've got 12 part-time nursery employees, I've got about 13 part-time child development center employees, we've got our BSA teachers, our Bethel School of the Arts teachers and instructors. So we have to add those up. We're about 41 or 42 full-time employees when you add all of our part-time employees into it. If we were to get higher than where we're at, if we were to approach 50 where we had to provide the Affordable Health Care Act for everybody, we would have to start cutting things because we couldn't afford to do it. It's really interesting in that. So we have to follow the Civil Rights Act, Title VII of the Civil Rights. It does apply to churches. It forbids discrimination in hiring, firing, compensation terms, conditions, or privileges of employment on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, and nation of origin. Churches may discriminate for religion in the case of hiring ministry professionals. So we can discriminate. We don't have to hire a Muslim to be a pastor here. But that doesn't necessarily mean we have the same option for an administrative assistant. That's why we don't, and I think all of our administrative staff currently attend our church. But we do not make that a condition of employment. I prefer that. We have to follow fair labor standards, which provides for the minimum wage. Churches must comply with its act. Churches cannot use contract labor to skirt these requirements. Interns have to be interns. State law, employment at will doctrine. The church's employees work at the employer's will. The church may terminate the employment relationship for good reason, bad reason, or no reason at all. The employer may do all the same. An at-will statement should be placed in the first pages of the personnel policy manual. But again, just because you put something in the policy manual, if state employment laws do not allow for this, it doesn't necessarily give you an insulation from litigation. So Virginia is an at-will state. So we have that in our employment manual. People know that. But again, this is why legal review is so very important, because they'll cover things. Something along this line should be in your policy manual, a disclaimer. This manual is intended for use by supervisors and managers only and should not be distributed and shared with non-supervisory employees. This manual does not constitute a contract of employment with any employee, supervisor, manager, and or contract for any benefits, procedures, or policy described herein. This manual supersedes any prior handbooks or policy statements regarding the matters described. The church reserves the right to revise this manual at any time. What is that called? That's called a blanket statement to cover you and take care of you. A policy manual should be updated whenever a policy is added, deleted, or changed. So we actually reflect revisions in the policy manual. Suggested handbook content. These would be good things to be recognized. A welcome, church history, mission statement, doctrinal beliefs, introduction to the church itself. And those are things that you should cover. Should be in a general handbook. Now, the different sections of a policy manual. This is what this portion is. I'm going to go through these slides very quick because you have them here. And I don't want to give a whole lot of definition But I want you to understand these are different things that should be considered in a policy manual section by section, okay? And this is, we pulled this from Frizzy Consulting. EEOC, those are important: equal opportunity, employment at will, staff structure, employment classifications, administer qualifications for special tax provisions, so who gets to have the housing allowance, employment status for federal income tax purposes, who's a contract employee, who is a self-employed, those kind of things. Immigration law compliance, you have to have a green card to work here. Pastor Victor had a green card when he worked here, because he still hadn't gotten a, American citizenship after living here for 20 years. So probationary period, if that's stipulated in there. Employment of minors, employment of relatives. Bethel used to have a policy that we would not hire two people that were related. That came from the time in Bethel's history when they used to allow not senior pastors, they used to allow pastoral staff to hire their spouse as a secretary for them. And it presented all sorts of challenges when the pastor would go out of town, so would their secretary. And that created work challenges. So we actually modified the nepotism clause a couple of years ago that would allow two people that are related to work at Bethel as long as they were not in the same department. So I could not hire Heather, my wife, to work for me, but she could work here at Bethel as long as it wasn't directly reported to me. So that right there is what allows us to hire Lacey Ware and John Ware. Otherwise, one of them would have to quit, and that would be sad. So life-threatening, infectious, communicable diseases, how do you handle when people are sick? Church members who are employees, which for us is the majority. These are things you should consider. What are the expectations? This typically will range right around your confidentiality stuff, what the expectations of information and such are. Compensation section, cover pay periods. Are you paid weekly or bi-weekly, monthly, once a year? Do you do advancements on pay? Hopefully you're paid more than once a year. Although that would be, I think most people have had a horrible idea on how to budget if you got paid once a year. Bank deposit plan. We do all of our payroll here through direct deposit. We do not issue checks. Time sheets, you have to do time cards. You have to handle overtime. We don't do overtime here. Everyone's a salary employee. There's no hourly employees here. Replenishment time, do you accrue time over, do you accrue vacation and sick leave over time, or do you get it annually? We actually do, on your pay stub, it shows that you accrue, but we know that if you get 2 weeks a year, you can get that 2 weeks at the beginning of the year. You just won't be able to take vacation in the future. Payroll deductions, what kind of withholding garnishments was this thing? Lost paychecks, how to handle that. Do direct deposit, hard to lose those. Staff gifts, if we actually have a policy, this is really typically more applicable to pastoral staff. We have a specific policy in the staff manual for employment, for reimbursements for speaking engagements in which you are paid. So if I were to go speak in a church in Richmond and they did not pay me, I could turn in mileage as a reimbursement from the church. But if I go speak at a church in Richmond and they give me an honorarium, I can turn in mileage here at Bethel if I give the honorarium to the church also. Because otherwise it's double dipping. Yeah. So we have things. So those are things. How do you handle it if somebody in the congregation gives you, because this happens periodically. We call them Pentecostal handshakes. They shake your hand with $100 in it. What do? Do you turn that in to the office as a income? I don't know how we have that stipulated here. It hasn't actually happened here. Honorarium paid staff, that's what I just talked about there. Shifting income to family members, we don't allow that. Work made for hire, that's contract employees. Final paycheck. How do you get it? Well, yeah, but what do you have to do? What requirements do you have to complete? Yeah, all that stuff. Confidentiality of salary and wages. That actually is one of the things that we stipulate in our policy manual. You do not discuss what you're paid. Unless you're an intern, everybody knows what you're paid. So, sorry. Workplace guidelines, what are just general expectations? Employee photos, do we have those? We don't do those. Personal appearance and dress code, we do have that stipulated. Open door arrangement, we have that stipulated also. We actually have something in ours that is called a 24-hour policy, which we require employees to work out any conflict within 24 hours. If they do not, and it rears its head at a later date, there is the opportunity for disciplinary action for failure to complete that. And if an employee is unwilling or unable to resolve something within 24 hours because of they're uncomfortable with the person they have to confront, they're allowed to go to the next level supervisor. So let's say, let's say Candace didn't want to talk to me about a problem. She could go talk to Pastor Charles or Pastor Glenn in regards to the conflict we're having there. But we don't actually have that. Parking on church facilities, again, these things, who parks where? We know that this area over here is pastoral parking, but recording time work, these are all things. Tardiness and absences, we have that stipulated in there. Inclement weather, we're really big on inclement weather. Leaving office during regular hours, is some churches, they actually have a sign in, sign out. We give a lot of freedom here at Bethel. We don't require people to sign in and sign out, but I know churches that they actually do it electronically. People have to punch a time clock electronically. Breaks, lunch periods, we have that stipulated here. Lunch is between 11:30 and 1:30. It cannot start before 11:30. It has to be done by 1:30. That's actually the policy that we have here at Bethel. Staff meetings, who's the expectation for attending personnel files and records. An employee here at Bethel may access their personnel file anytime they like. Outside of that, the only people with access to personnel files are the executive pastor of operations, the lead pastor, and the stewardship director. Grievances and complaints, that should say grievances, but we just make up a new word there. Grievances and complaints. That's the third time I've used this PowerPoint, first time I've seen that. Making suggestions, how do you got a suggestion box? Sexual and other forms of harassment, how do you handle those? How is that addressed? Personal and romantic relationships, are employees allowed to date each other? If they're not married, we don't have a policy against that. If they're married, we really frown upon here. Drug-free workplace, sale of personal merchandise. We do not allow you to sell stuff here in the office. Otherwise, people would be bringing their kids' stuff in every week, and it would drive us nuts. I have had to tell people more than once, that's against the policy manual, please do not there. Employee family members. This really deals more with, can they just come hang out in the office? How's that work? Sometimes people forget churches are actually employment places. They think we're just here praying all day. Outside employment and activities. What if one of your pastoral staff members wants to have another job? Are they allowed? So these are questions that need to be answered. Personal mail. I get packages delivered here all the time from Amazon that don't have anything to do with work because sometimes they're gifts for heaven. Personal and ethic responsibility, those are all pretty clear. Financial integrity. Conducting tours, are you allowed to just walk whoever you want through the office? Do they have to sign in? These are things to consider. Counseling sessions, we already talked about that. Confidentiality of church information, we talked about that. Copyright infringements. Copyright's an interesting thing. The church doesn't have as much copyright freedom as the college does. The college, as a educational institute, is allowed to make copies of things for distribution in the right context. But churches are also interesting in the fact that when a pastor preaches a sermon at a church, according to copyright and rights of broadcast, that kind of stuff, I forget what the actual term is, it's slipping my mind right now. Technically, the message belongs to the church, not the pastor. So if the pastor decides to write a book off of messages that they've preached at the church, now the church actually would have the rights to that book. But if the church were to decide to give the rights to the pastor, now they have given them a taxable right because they gave them an asset, which would be the copyrights to those sermons. So copyrights, it's very interesting. It's really interesting. Again, we actually have a policy, it's stated in our policy manual that all works of, whether it be written or spoken, even when used on church equipment, belong to the person that created them, not the organization. So here's why this is important. Saddleback Church found itself entrenched in a lawsuit between their former children's pastor, who had started writing curriculum when he was the children's pastor, and when he left, decided to continue to sell it, and Saddleback claimed it was theirs, because he wrote it on church equipment, on church time. and they didn't have the product stipulated. So I don't know how they've resolved that actually. Whereas I have another friend who, we've used his curriculum for a while, it's called High Voltage. Their church has the policy that once it's been used for church purposes, it goes to a historical document status, which allows him to utilize it however he so chooses. So he runs a curriculum company out of material that he produces for the church, and the church has agreed to that. So, those are important things to know. Those are important things to know. Intellectual rights, that's what I'm looking at. Intellectual property rights. Those are things that you need to be aware of. So, access to and removal of church property. We've actually had employees get in trouble for this, of taking things that did not belong to them, that belong to the church, and using it for personal gains. So, issuance of church property and equipment, we've got a policy, we don't rent it out. Use of church telephones. This is less of an issue in today's day and age, but one of the churches I first started on staff at, I had to keep a long distance log. I had to, what time I made the call, what number I called, and if it was for work purposes, I was fine. If it was for personal purposes, I had to reimburse the church. So, those are interesting things to consider. Use of telephone credit cards, that's getting old. Use of long distance access, those are getting old. Use of church computers and internet access, what's appropriate, what's not. Use of church software, email usage, use of fax machines. We actually have stipulated in the email usage that no communication should be considered private and confidential from the executive leadership team. So if you use the church email to communicate something, we have the right to check your email anytime we so choose. It's stipulated in there. And part of that is because people don't always use it correctly. So, use of church fax machines and copiers. Rented vehicle insurance, service on church committees and ministry teams. Could you have a pastoral staff wife or a pastoral staff member on a committee outside of their original job, cashing a personal check? This is really a rare instance. We don't even have that stipulated. Personally owned property. This is something that we've had to stipulate for our electronics devices. We do not allow privately owned, personally owned laptops to connect to our shared drive. We've got our network drive. Pastor Jose has been working on his personal MacBook Air, and he asked to be connected to our shared drive, and we don't. And that's just a safety and security procedure. Is why we do that. Personal use of church stationery. Yeah, don't do that. Food and drinks. Don't steal from the cafe. Posting on church bulletin boards. We fortunately, praise Jesus, don't have bulletin boards around here. But some churches, they've got bulletin boards everywhere, and they've got a lot of policies on it. Workplace guidelines, expense reimbursements. How are you reimbursed? Workplace violence, don't do it. Workplace safety and security. These are all things, again, that you need to be aware of. Criminal background checks, volunteer service, miscellaneous responsibility of employees. There's that one line that's always put in everyone's job description, other duties as assigned. That's the one thing that everyone always puts in there that we love to hear. Again, this is just an overview of things that need to be considered. The benefits section, these are things that need to be considered in there. Vacation, holidays, leave of absence. Bethel actually stipulates that after 3 years of employment, you are entitled to 1 week of sabbatical leave, which I haven't taken. I should consider taking that. I've been here for 5 years, so I've got another week coming next year. But
Do the weeks compound?
no, probably not. Well, no, I'd have to check. Probably not. We actually, like for a vacation at Bethel, we have a policy that you can carry 1 week of vacation over to the next year. And I never use all my vacation, so I've always carried an extra week over. I've got 4 weeks of vacation a year, and I can carry a week over. So I've got 5 weeks of vacation right now. Actually, right now I think I've used 2. I'm not going to use 3 more weeks before the end of the year. I don't have time. I've got too much work to do. Holidays, we're very generous in that. Leave of absence, sick leave. So like when I go to class, in wherever, St. Paul or California, wherever I happen to go, my next one's in California, that's considered ministry related, so it's not vacation. So yeah, it's great. And I get like 3 weeks of ministry time a year in addition to my vacation. Sick leave days, cafeteria plan, those are retirement. Anniversary recognition, retirement, participation. Like I do a 5% contribution of my salary to my retirement plan. and Bethel matches that. Short-term salary continuance, after you've been terminated, is there a severance package, that kind of thing. Social Security, who pays what, workers' compensation insurance, we do pay in workers' comp. Federal and state unemployment programs, we do not participate. Churches do not participate in unemployment. First Church Academy, okay, so this would be an example. This is actually what kind of benefits, such as CDC tuition, BSA tuition, those kind of things. Continuing education, professional membership. Do you provide some kind of things along those lines? Educational assistance plan. Bethel has one, and they occasionally choose to deviate from it, but we have to do so with the board approval. Dependent care assistance plan, these are all legal terms. Health reimbursement arrangements. Church cellular telephones, pagers, laptops, computers, etc. These, I carry this around with me everywhere, but this belongs to the church. This is the church's iPad. If I were to leave, it would stay with the church, or I'd have to figure out how to steal it without any moral compunctions. So, meals provided in the church cafeteria, we don't have one. Commuting and parking fringe benefits, okay, those are bonuses for cost-saving ideas. If somebody saves the church $10,000 a year, are you going to give them a little spiff for that? You're a hard boss. Hard boss. Shared leave donation programs. We don't actually have this specified, but we have occasionally allowed this to happen. When we have somebody that's had an extended leave or an extended sickness or illness, we have allowed them to, we've allowed other employees to contribute sick time to them. Spiritual retreat day, the pastoral staff is allowed one a month. Relocation upon time of call/employment. Are you going to pay for moving? Ministering to staff members, I think that's all. Ministerial staff activities are all pretty clear. Minister's housing allowance, we've already talked about that. Minister's taxes and financial plan, we talked about that. Fringe benefits, highly compensated employees, how are they handled differently? Those are all just things to consider. General information for performance standards. This is another section that is important. I told you we're going through them pretty fast, just so we can have a good, again, this is just an overview of things to consider. You don't have to have every one of these elements included. If you did, I would be really impressed. Personal memo, personnel memo, those kind of stuff. Leadership position descriptions, that goes back to earlier job descriptions. Performance evaluations, what are the standards? Transfers and promotions, what are the opportunities? Terminations, how is that handled? Retirement, those are things that you consider. Acknowledgement to sign. Employee statement of acknowledgement of receipt of employee handbook. This is important. You don't want somebody to say they weren't aware of something because they didn't read it. If you have a signed statement saying that they read it, even if they didn't, still not your fault. Use of church computer and internet access, that should be a signed statement so they're aware of it. Acknowledgement of church code of ethics, safety code for Church Inc., acknowledgement of that. Those could all be combined into one. Supporting attachments, church code of ethics, safety policy procedure, that kind of stuff. These are all things that we should consider having. Distribution, who should receive a policy manual? All supervisors. Signed statement of receipt of manual. So when they receive a manual, they should acknowledge that they have received it, and then they should have some other form that says they will sign statement of receipt when they're done, and then acknowledge that they have read it and understand it. One of the things that you also should include in the distribution and the signed statements is a signed confidentiality statement that states that they understand the expectation for confidentiality and protecting church information. Evaluation, periodic, legal, practical, congregational retreat. So what it says is you should do it on a regular basis, make sure that it is reviewed with the legal counsel, and make sure that the policies that you have created actually are applicable. That they're not just crazy things that you've made up. If you have, depending on your church structure, we would not use a congregational review of a policy manual outside of maybe some of the procedural stuff. And do you need to have a team and a retreat kind of thing review it? Okay, so that is, in a nutshell, what you should be considering in a policy manual.